The Belgian Malinois went rigid at 30 feet from the timbered portal. Wade Harlan stopped with one hand on her collar, watching the way her shoulders set themselves like a frame around a held breath. The light was going off the holler. Behind him, the creek ran low, and the September air smelled of leaf mold and wet hickory and, faintly, of something older, something coal dust dry, leaking out of the rotted plank face of the entry below the sycamores. He had not been up this draw since the spring he buried his grandfather. 21 years and 7 months, give or take. The path had grown over twice and been recut by deer enough times that he could still find it without thinking. Halifax did not know the path. She knew what her nose was reading, and she knew her handler had stopped. And she stayed rigid, the way a dog stays rigid when she is asking permission to back away. Wade did not give her that permission. He put one knee down beside her on the leaf litter and let her smell the back of his hand for a long second, the way she liked when something had gone wrong inside her head. Then he stood and looked at the portal. It was barely a portal anymore. 3 timbers across the top, sagging in the center under 77 years of hill creep. A face of vertical boards nailed up in a hurry. Behind the boards where the planks had warped, you could see the dark fold of Brattice cloth. Heavy cotton canvas, once white, now the color of an old coffee stain. The Pocahontas No. 4 slope mine, B section, sealed by Earl Harlan, his grandfather, on the 4th of October, 1947. He had grown up on the story without ever really hearing it. His grandfather had sealed his own bench section the day after a roof fall took 2 men on his shift, and he had walked out and never gone back. That was the family sentence. 8 words and a closed door. Wade had been 26 when the old man died, and Earl had still never spoken the names of the 2 men. Wade buried him in 2003 in the family plot above the Methodist church at Lobata, and shipped out for Iraq 9 days later, and had carried the unfinished sentence with him through 22 years of the Corps. Through MARSOC selection in 2009, through 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 1 to Mosul in 2014, and the bad West Africa rotation in 2022. He had stood at his mother's grave in April. He had handed his retirement papers across a desk in Tampa in May. The lease on the apartment in Camp Lejeune ended in July. He had loaded a Footlocker, a duffel, and the dog into the bed of the truck and driven north. The Harlan name in this story I have kept, the Wilkinson name and one date I have altered, because Lottie Wilkinson's daughter is still alive in Williamson, and her permission was not mine to give. The mine and the holler and the dog are real. The rest you read at your own discretion. Wade clicked his tongue twice. Halifax came off the rigid posture and pressed her shoulder against his thigh, which was her way of asking, "What now?" He told her, "Stay close, sweetheart," and walked the last 30 feet to the portal with his hand on her collar. Halifax was a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois, 64 pounds when he weighed her in August, lean across the back, the way a Mao carries lean even at 12 years. She had been a working military dog with 1st Marine Special Operations Battalion, the same MARSOC unit Wade had finished selection in at Camp Lejeune in 2009. Her handler had been a staff sergeant named Cole Robles. Cole had run the patrol element on a small village reduction somewhere in the western Sahel in the spring of 2022, and had died on the back of a pickup when the lead vehicle hit a pressure plate. Halifax had been on the second vehicle and had come back to Lackland on a C-17. The kennel there had her on the redeploy list for a month before Wade got the call. He had known Cole. He had known Cole's wife. He had asked for the transfer through 3 different staff officers and got it the week before his own retirement was approved. They had been each other's 3rd dog and 3rd handler and had been quiet about it from the first night in the apartment when she had sat at his boot until he laid down on the floor with her and slept on the carpet rather than ask her to come up. Now they stood together at the portal where his grandfather had nailed up the plank face 77 Octobers ago. Wade put a hand on the upper timber, and the timber felt the way old timber feels when the heart is still under the punky outer shell. He scraped a little of the surface with his thumbnail. The wood under it was hard. Not coal mine timbering, hickory. His grandfather had walked the ridge himself for that wood. The Pocahontas Coal Company had not paid for it. He stepped back. Halifax stepped with him. "All right," he said mostly to her. "We're not going in tonight. We're going in clean and slow and with the cross pull set, the way Earl would have done it. Tonight you and I sleep in the cabin." The Malinois flicked one ear toward him at the sound of the name Earl, and then away. She did not know the name. She knew the tone. Wade exhaled, and they turned together and walked up the cut path to the cabin above the entry. The cabin was a one-room hardwood place his grandfather had built in 1939, about 3 years before he shipped out on the USS Mississippi as a third-class machinist's mate. Earl had been 23 when he laid the sills. He had come back in 46, married Wade's grandmother Verna at the Methodist Church in Lobata, gone back to the number 4 slope in May of 46, and built this cabin out by the second adit, so he would not have to walk an hour each way to the Holler House in winter. Verna had stayed in the Holler House. They had been 3 winters in this cabin together when the roof fall took the 2 men, and Earl sealed the entry and walked out and went home to the Holler House, and never built another room of this one. The doors swung on the original wrought iron hinges. The smith down at Williamson had forged them. Wade had the receipt in his grandfather's tin box at the house in Lobata. $5.75 the 3 of them. The hinges still moved like they had been oiled that morning. Inside the cook stove was a round oak, plain cast iron with a single flat top, the firebox door half off its lower hinge. Wade had brought a tin of stove black up from the Holler House and the new lower hinge in his rucksack. There was a board bunk against the north wall, a square hardwood table, a single shelf at head height with 3 tin cups inverted on it the way Earl had left them. The dust on the floor was 3/4 of an inch thick in places. The window glass on the east face was sound. The south one cracked diagonally from a frost in some winter Wade had never lived through. The cabin smelled of dry cedar and mouse, and, far underneath, the same coal dust smell that came up from the portal. He set his pack on the table. Halifax sniffed the corners and then sat in the doorway and watched the path. Wade put on a pair of nitrile gloves and swept the cabin out with a broom he had brought rolled in his pack. The dust came out in heavy clumps. He fixed the lower hinge on the firebox door. He laid a small fire of hickory kindling and a single split of seasoned red oak and lit it with one of the long matches he kept for the Coleman lantern at home. The cook stove drew the way Earl had taught its draught to draw, slow and clean, the smoke pulling up through the chimney without a single backwash into the room. He boiled water for coffee from a glass jug he had carried up from the spring at the head of the holler. He cut 2 slices of dark bread from a loaf his neighbor Mavis Boggs had given him at the Lobata post office that morning. He ate them at the table with butter and salt and a small piece of cheese. He gave Halifax the heel of the bread and half a fold of the bratwurst he had carried in wax paper. He drank the coffee black. He had not eaten this slowly since the West Africa rotation, and he caught himself thinking, as he chewed, that he was eating the way Earl used to eat. Slow, deliberate, not tasting much. The way a man eats when his mouth is occupied, so the rest of him does not have to be. The methane sensor was a Crocon Gas Pro he had bought refurbished from a mining supply outlet in Beckley in August. He calibrated it that morning at the Holler House against a span cylinder rated for 2% CH4 and clipped it to the strap of his pack. The display read 0.00. He took it down the path to the portal in the last gray of the day, placed it on the second timber from the bottom, set the audible alarm to 1%, well below the 5% lower explosive limit, and walked back up to the cabin in the dark. Halifax was already at the bunk. He laid out his bedroll on the board planks, and she walked across the bedroll to test it the way she always tested a new sleeping arrangement, and then settled at the foot with her muzzle on his boot. He turned out the kerosene lamp. The cook stove made its small ticks of cooling iron. Per the records I could find in his Navy separation file at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, my grandfather Earl Harlan never carried a sidearm after the war. The records may be incomplete. As far as I know, he never went down into the number 4 again either. The cabin he walked away from in October of 47 had stood empty 77 autumns, and now his grandson lay on the floor planks beside a Belgian Malinois, who had come home from a war Earl had not lived to see the start of, listening to the same wind, moving down the same draw, and the cabin held them both in its old patient hardwood, the way it had held a young man and a young wife 3 winters running, before the mountain had taken what the mountain takes. Halifax breathed out long and slow. Wade closed his eyes. The methane sensor at the portal 40 feet below them was reading, he knew without seeing it, 0.00%, and the cabin was warm, and the dog was at his boot. And for the first night in 5 months, he slept through. He came awake at 5:20 in the morning, the way he came awake at 5:20 every morning, with the dog already standing on his bedroll. Halifax was looking at the door. There was no sound. The cook stove had gone past its low ticking and into the deeper silence of cold iron. Wade lay on his back and looked at the rafters and thought, "All right." He sat up. He pulled his boots on with the laces left loose the way he always pulled them on first. He put a fresh fire of kindling and one split of seasoned oak into the firebox, and lit it, and closed the door and watched the chimney pool. The draft took. He put the speckled enamel pot on the stovetop with 3 cups of spring water and a measured palm of coffee grounds in it. While the water came up, he went out onto the cabin porch. The light was that flat October pre-dawn that does not reveal anything until the sun moves behind it. The methane sensor down at the portal showed, at this distance, a single small green LED. Steady. He stood with his coffee tin in his hand and watched the holler come up out of its night. He thought about his grandfather standing in this same doorway in the cold pre-dawn of the 4th of October, 1947. He thought about the 8-pound mason's maul and the pile of vertical hickory boards and the nails Earl had brought up from the holler house on a sledge to nail the face of the entry closed by himself, alone, in the rain. He thought about Verna at the holler house with their first child in her belly and a husband who came back up the path that night and did not speak for 48 hours. He thought about the long Harlan silence that had followed. He drank his coffee. He went back inside, fed Halifax a small portion of the dry kibble he kept in a sealed mason jar in the rucksack, ate 2 boiled eggs and a piece of dark bread, and then he put on his work gloves and his canvas barn coat, and he went down the path to the portal with the dog at his hip. Halifax stopped again at 30 feet. This was the same line she had drawn the evening before. Wade watched her and did not press. The methane sensor on the lower timber read 0.00. He walked the last 30 feet alone and let her hold her line where she had set it. The plank face of the portal was made of 7 vertical boards, roughly 1.5 inches thick by 10 inches wide, nailed across 3 horizontal crosspieces with what looked, when Wade brought his head close, to be 10-penny common nails driven by hand. The boards were rough-sawn hickory, weathered gray on the outside, hard inside. The nails were drawn from the same keg his grandfather had carried up to roof the cabin in '39. Wade knew this because the keg was still in the corner of the cabin shed, and one of his small private projects of August had been to count the remaining nails against the original keg weight stenciled on the side. He worked the first board off carefully. He used a 5-foot wrecking bar and pulled the nails one at a time, catching each in a tin can on the ground so they would not lie under the dog's paws later. The wood resisted the way old hickory resists. The first board came off in one piece. He set it aside, leaned against the timber, and looked at what he had uncovered. The Brattice cloth was double-stitched canvas, 11 feet wide, fastened across the interface of the portal with 3 rows of heavy roofing tacks driven through wooden lath. In the lower right corner, in the standard mining supply stencil that the Pocahontas Coal Company had used through the 40s, were the painted letters B section, P4. Below the stencil, in his grandfather's careful pencil hand, the date 4X, 1947. The X was the Roman 10 that Earl used because he had been taught Roman numerals at the one-room school at Lobata in the early 20s and had used them all his life. October the 4th, Pocahontas, number 4. Wade stood there for a longer moment than he had planned. Then he went to work on the second board. By 8:30, he had the full face of the portal off. He laid the 7 boards in order on a tarp on the leaf litter so he could rebuild the face exactly if the new code citation came down the way he thought it might. The Brattice itself he did not cut yet. He sat down on the lowest timber and let his shoulders drop. Halifax came forward 4 feet and stopped at the new line. Inside behind the Brattice, he could already smell it. The dry, faintly bituminous, faintly mineral, faintly cedar smell of a sealed slope mine bench section that had stood at 51 degrees Fahrenheit and 38% relative humidity for 77 Octobers. I should say a word about that here because the Brattice surviving is the part most people would not believe, and a viewer who knows mining will be the first to call it out. A working mine atmosphere underground in central Appalachia, even at the depths of a small slope mine like the number 4, generally runs 5 to 10 degrees cooler than the surface annual mean, and at a relative humidity that depends on the water table and on the ventilation circuit. The number 4 was driven into the local coal seam at a shallow slope, 22 degrees off horizontal, with the bench section ending at about 140 feet of horizontal penetration. The water table runs 80 feet lower in that part of Mingo County than the bench bottom, per the West Virginia Geological Survey maps from 1968. When the entry was sealed and the ventilation cross-pull cut off, the atmosphere inside the section would have equilibrated quickly to the surrounding rock temperature, which the survey gives as 51 degrees, and the humidity would have dropped to the saturated equilibrium dew point of about 38%. Below dew point, no condensation. Cotton canvas at 38% relative humidity and 51 degrees ages slowly. Slowly enough that I have seen, in my own poking around the abandoned coal camp drifts of central Appalachia over 20-some years, cotton flags and miner's gloves from the 1930s still pliable in the hand. The Pocahontas number 4 was not a wet mine. The Brattice would have held. It had held. Wade reached forward and put his fingers against it. Canvas, warmer than the timber. The fibers came apart slightly at his touch where the seam had aged, but the cloth in the center of the panel was sound. He cut the lashing on the right side with his pocket knife, a buck 110 his father had given him at 12, and folded the panel back to the left across the timber. The bench section opened ahead of him in the lamplight. He had clipped his headlamp to his ball cap. The beam ran out into a roughly square gallery, maybe 9 feet wide and 7 feet high, with the coal floor sloping away from him at the 22 degrees of the original face. The roof timbers were old hardwood, not the standard machine-milled mine timbers the Pocahontas Coal Company had supplied, but the same hand-cut hickory Earl had used on the cabin roof. The roof bolting was absent. Roof bolting as a technique was not standard in Appalachian coal mining until the mid-1950s. In 1947, a small slope mine bench section would have been timbered the old way, with hand-set hardwood posts on 3-foot centers. Earl had done exactly that, and then walked away. Wade did not go further than 10 feet into the bench section that morning. He stood and let his beam play across the roof timbers. 3 of them, in his estimate, were rotted at the cap plate junction. The rest were sound the way only old hand-cut hickory stays sound. He counted the failures. Timber 3 from the entry, timber 7, timber 11. The fall in 47 had been further back than that. Earl's note in the family Bible. Wade had it in the cabin. Said the fall took the men at 21 timbers in. Wade was looking at the first 11. 11 was where his work would stop. On the floor of the bench, halfway down to the first failed timber, sat a green-painted footlocker, the standard size of a U.S. Navy ship's footlocker, 29 inches long by 16 wide by 12 deep, with brass corner brackets and a brass clasp. The paint was original. The stencil on the lid read, Harlan E.M., 3 C.U.S.N., Mississippi. Earl had been a third-class machinist mate on the USS Mississippi, battleship BB-41, from sometime in the spring of 42 through to his discharge in the autumn of 45. The Mississippi had taken him to the Gilberts and the Marshalls and Surigao Strait and Okinawa. He had come home and married Verna, and gone down the number 4 3 weeks later, and the footlocker had come home with him, in the back of a Lobata produce truck, driven by a cousin who never charged him for the ride. It sat on the bench floor in front of Wade now. He left it where it was. He folded the Brattice back across the timber, lashed it in place with new tarred jute he had brought up from the holler house, walked out of the entry, and sat down on the leaf litter and put a hand on Halifax's neck and breathed. She held very still under his hand. She knew, in the way working dogs know without language, that this was not a moment for her to ask anything. He sat with her about 10 minutes. Then he stood and went up to the cabin and ate a midday meal of dark bread and butter and a tin of sardines, and drank the last of the coffee cold. He had set himself a 4-day window for the work that needed doing before he could move down into the bench in any settled way. By midday on the second day, he had the new timbering laid out. 3 sets of Genmar resin-bolted roof support to be installed at timbers 3, 7, and 11, with supplemental hand-cut hardwood cribbing in the old style at the junctions. The Genmar bolts he had bought through a mining supply jobber out of Pikeville, Kentucky, who knew not to ask questions. The hardwood for the cribbing he had cut himself in August from a single downfall hickory on his own ridge. The cross-pull ventilation was the part of the work he wanted to settle first, because methane in a sealed bench section is the thing that quietly kills retired Marines who think they understand a mountain. A slope mine like the number 4 was driven into the side of the ridge, with the entry at the lower edge of the seam, and the bench section worked upslope from there. The original ventilation had run on a single fan at the entry, pulling air down the slope across the working face and back up through a return added cut at the upper edge of the seam, about 40 feet up the ridge. When Earl sealed the lower entry in 47, he had also nailed a plank over the upper return adit. The return adit was about 18 inches square, framed in hardwood, and it sat at the foot of a beech tree that Wade's grandmother used to pick chanterelles around in the autumn. Wade had been up to it on the second day of August and pulled the plank off and watched the dust move slowly across his hand and known the section was not wet. Now with the lower entry open, he had the geometry he needed for a clean cross pull, a steady natural draw of cool air down through the upper return, across the bench floor, and out the lower entry. The wind that morning was from the northwest at perhaps 6 knots. The Crocon at the lower portal read a draw velocity of 0.4 meters per second when he checked it at 9:40. Methane, 0.00. Oxygen, 20.9. Carbon monoxide, 0. He let the section ventilate for the rest of the day with both ends open, and walked Halifax up the ridge to the upper adit. She went up the path on her own this time without hesitation, which told him what he needed to know about the upper end of the circuit. Air was moving the right way. The dog read the air, and the air was clean. That evening on the cabin porch, he wrote the day's readings in a small leather notebook he had carried in his vest pocket for years. He wrote them in the Marine Staff Sergeant's hand he had learned at MARSOC's selection in 2009. All uppercase, every figure measured with a pencil. Cross-pull velocity 0.4, CH4 0.00, O2 20.9, CO 0. Outside temperature 53, inside temperature 51. Same numbers Earl might have written down in 1946 when he opened the bench section the first time. Same column, same hand-cut hardwood roof timbers. Same dog at the boot, only she was a Belgian Malinois, and Earl's had been a red-bone coonhound mix named, his grandmother had told him once, simply Hound. He banked the fire down. Halifax ate her evening kibble and laid herself across his boots. He read for an hour from his grandfather's spare copy of the King James, which was the only book that had been in the cabin when he came up. And then he turned out the lamp. Day 1 of work done. By day 3, he had the Genmar bolts in at timbers 3, 7, and 11. The hand-cut hardwood cribbing installed at the junctions, the Brattice cloth at the entry rebuilt with a new central panel, and the original side panels preserved. Halifax began entering the bench with him on the morning of the 3rd day. He saw her cross the 30-foot line, slow, with her ears forward, and come up to the lower timbering, and put her nose against the new resin where it had set in the bolt hole. She held the nose against the bolt for perhaps 8 seconds. Then she stepped back and looked up at him. Her shoulders had come out of the rigid set they had been in 2 days running. He told her, "All right, sweetheart," and she walked the next 8 feet with him to the green footlocker and lay down beside it. He opened the footlocker at noon on the 3rd day. Inside, an oilskin wrap holding the cap of a 3rd-class machinist's mate and a folded set of navy dress blues. A tin can of his grandfather's hand tools, the ones he used on his own equipment underground. 3 slip-joint pliers, 2 crescent wrenches, a roll of waxed cotton lacing twine, a small ball-peen hammer, a leather-bound King James Bible with Verna's maiden name penciled on the inside cover, a brown paper envelope addressed in Earl's hand to Mrs. T. Wilkinson, General Delivery Lobata, West Virginia, with no return address. The envelope was sealed. Wade lifted it once, weighed it in his palm, and put it back without opening it. He was not ready for the envelope, not on the third day. He pegged the rag rug, Verna's rag rug, the one she had wove the winter of 1946 from cotton feed sack strips, that had lain folded on the bench floor under a layer of cotton drugget cloth, dry, almost intact, down on the floor of the bench section, about 20 feet in from the new portal. He laid the original cotton drugget back across the centerboards. He set up a small folding camp stool. He brought down the kerosene lamp from the cabin and clipped it into the bracket he had bolted to the timber. The bracket was not Earl's. Earl had used an open lamp on a rock shelf. Wade had bolted a modern wrought iron lamp bracket because the open shelf gave him an unreasonable feeling about a methane release that the Crocon could not predict. He did not yet know about the second Brattice. He found it that evening. Halifax had been pacing the lower bench in a slow figure of 8 and had stopped at a place about 18 feet from the new entry, 3 feet from the right-hand wall. She lowered her front quarters and pressed her nose against the wall and held. Wade came over and ran his hand along the wall where she was holding, and the wall was not wall. It was loose rockfill, mortared crudely with what looked like a single course of fieldstone behind it. He pulled 3 of the upper stones aside. Behind them, set back into the rib of the section, sat a second Brattice. Smaller, maybe 4 feet wide, older canvas. The lashing was double knotted. He cut the lashing with the buck 110. Behind the second Brattice, the bench section opened into a hand-cut alcove, 80 inches long, 50 inches wide, 56 inches high, set against the inner rib at the deepest point Earl had cut on his own. Inside the alcove, a hand-pegged hardwood sleeping bench, raised 6 inches off the floor, the legs mortised and pegged, the planks fitted tongue and groove, a folded woolen blanket, and a second rag rug, smaller, in red and green wool strips. An oil lamp socket bolted into the rock at head height, with a wick still stiff in the brass burner. A second folded letter, this one pinned to the inner timber with a horseshoe nail. The paper stained brown at the folds, the ink faded to coffee color. The date was visible across the top, 8th October 1947. Wade did not move for a long moment. Halifax had come into the alcove behind him and lay down on the rag rug as if she had been waiting all her life for it. He did not open the letter that night either. He let himself sit on the bench with his back against the inner timber and the Malinois on the rug and the kerosene lamp lit above him and the cross-pull moving cool, clean 51-degree air past his shoulder. He closed his eyes for a long second. Earl had not sealed this bench because the mountain was unsafe. The mountain at this section was unusually sound for an Appalachian coal slope. Wade understood, sitting on the bench in the lamplight, that his grandfather had sealed the bench because he had built himself a place to sleep where the dead men had died, and then had not been able to walk past it twice in a single morning ever again, and had nailed the face up and walked out and lived another 56 years in the holler house, and never once spoken the names of the 2 men. Earl had built the deeper bench not as shelter from the mountain. He had built it as the place he wanted to be when the mountain finally took him to, and when the mountain had not, that October week, he had walked out and let the deeper bench keep the room it had become. Halifax let out a single long breath against Wade's calf. Wade put a hand down on her shoulder. He did not say anything. The lamp guttered slightly in a low breath of air from the cross-pole. He looked up at the inner timber, where the letter was pinned with the horseshoe nail, and read the date again. October 8th, 1947. And then he closed the Brattice behind him and the second Brattice in front of him, and they went back up to the cabin together and slept the night through. Earl Boggs came up the cabin track in his county truck at 3:40 in the afternoon of the 14th of October. Wade heard the engine on the gravel 2 switchbacks down. The Malinois was already at the door, ears forward, her hackles flat. Whoever was coming, she had decided, was not what she was going to call a threat. Wade stepped out onto the porch with a coffee tin in his hand and the work gloves still on. The truck stopped 20 feet short of the cabin. The man who climbed out was perhaps 58, broad in the shoulder, with the heavy-jawed Harlan face and a county-issue khaki shirt with a state seal embroidered above the pocket. He was Wade's second cousin, once removed. His grandfather, Russell Harlan, had been the brother of Earl Harlan, and Russell had driven the body wagon for the Pocahontas number 4 dead in the autumn of '47, and had not been the same man for the rest of his life. Earl Boggs took his name from his maternal grandfather, but the broad Harlan jaw was his father's. "Wade," he said. He raised a hand. "Earl, got something I need to give you. Come on up." Earl Boggs came up the porch steps the way an older man in the Code Enforcement Office of Mingo County, West Virginia, comes up onto a porch when the porch belongs to a cousin whose grandfather had been his own great-uncle. Carefully, Halifax stood up at her place by the door and watched. Earl Boggs put his hand out, palm down, the way a man who has been around hill dogs all his life puts a hand out, and Halifax came forward 2 steps and sniffed the back of his fingers and went back to her place at the door. "Good dog," Earl Boggs said. "She is." He pulled an envelope out of his shirt pocket. "Manila. County seal." He held it for a second. "It ain't personal, Wade. I know. You'd have got it anyway. I just figured I'd bring it up myself. Appreciate it." Earl Boggs handed him the envelope, and Wade opened it on the porch rail and read it standing. It was a notice of required compliance under the West Virginia Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, Title 22, Chapter 3, Section 22, as amended in the WV Mine Safety Statutes of 1977. The notice stated that the abandoned slope mine entry at GPS coordinates listed on the 3rd page, the number 4, had been identified during a routine ridge survey by the WV Office of Abandoned Mine Lands as a private mine working in a non-sealed condition, posing a potential hazard to public safety under the criteria of the Act. The compliance requirement read, "The property owner shall, no later than the 1st day of November in the year of this notice, install a concrete and steel mine entry plug of standard dimensions per Appendix C of the regulations, or alternatively, shall apply for and document an owner-occupant personal use exemption with full ventilation, methane monitoring, and structural certification by a licensed mining engineer." Wade read the 3rd page twice. He folded the notice back into the envelope. "November 1st, he said. "Right, that's 17 days. That's the standard window." "Earl, the entry is timbered. I have a cross-pull set. I have a crocon at the lower portal and a second one going in at the upper return tomorrow." "I know it. I have it in better shape now than it has been since the year your great-uncle Earl Harlan walked away from it." "I know that too." Earl Boggs took his cap off and set it on the porch rail and ran his hand back across the short gray hair he had under it. He was sweating slightly even in the October cool. "Wade, I ain't the man on the other end of this." The office in Charleston flagged it after some kind of LiDAR survey out of a federal grant. I do not have the name of the project in front of me. They got the GPS. They got photographs of the new plank face you nailed up 2 weeks ago. They sent the file down to me to walk up here and put it in your hand because I'm the closest county officer with the rotation, and because, well, because they know we're family. Wade did not say anything. "You can file the exemption," Earl Boggs said. "The form is in the envelope. It needs a structural certification from a mining engineer. There's a man down at Beckley I can get you a meeting with. He's done 4 or 5 of these for the small slope mines down the Tug Fork. He's reasonable. He don't ask the wrong questions. How long does the certification take? From the day he walks the entry, about 3 weeks for the paperwork to clear Charleston. Maybe 4. November 1st is the trigger date. If you've filed the exemption application and have a certifying engineer scheduled by November 1st, the Act gives you the working window. All right, I'll get you that name tonight. Thank you, Earl." Earl Boggs put his cap back on. He looked at the door of the cabin and at Halifax sitting in it, and at the cookstove pipe rising up through the cedar shake roof. He said slowly, "I'll tell you, Wade. I never came up here when I was a boy. My daddy never brought me up the holler. My granddaddy, your great-uncle Russell, he wouldn't let any of us up this draw past the number 4 turn. I always wondered why. I think you know now. I think I do." The 2 men stood at the porch rail. The afternoon was going off the holler. Halifax watched them both. Earl Boggs put his hand out one more time, this time to Wade, and they shook the way 2 men of a long Appalachian family shake when there is more left unsaid than said. "November 1st, Earl Boggs said again, more to the porch rail than to Wade. "November 1st. The county truck went back down the switchbacks. Wade stood with the manila envelope in his hand for a longer moment than he had planned. Then he went inside, set the envelope on the cabin table, fed Halifax her evening kibble, and laid the second Crocon out on the table, and ran the calibration procedure against the span cylinder one more time. He did not eat supper that evening. He sat at the table with the door open and watched the October dusk settle the holler down, and thought about engineers in Beckley and timbers and benches, and old letters pinned to inner timbers with horseshoe nails. And he banked the cook stove down at 9 and went to bed. Halifax woke him at 4:12. She did not bark. She stood up at the foot of the bedroll, walked once across his chest, walked back, stood at the doorway, and let out a single low chest cough that was the dog equivalent of a hand on the shoulder. Wade was awake before he was upright. He sat up in his bedroll. He looked at his wristwatch. 4:12. He put his boots on. The cabin had gone cold. The cook stove was at its lowest banked ember glow. The night outside had no wind in it. He pulled his canvas barn coat over his thermals and clipped the second Crocon to his vest and went out onto the porch. There was a small green LED at the portal 40 feet down. It was not steady. It was strobing slow, perhaps once every 2 seconds, the way the Crocon's display strobed when it was tracking a reading that was changing minute by minute. He walked down the path with Halifax at his hip. She walked the path with her head low and her ears forward. She did not cross her 30-foot line tonight. She stopped at it. He went the last 30 feet alone. The Crocon at the lower portal read 0.4. He stood for 1 second and watched the display. 0.4, 0.5, 0.5, 0.6. He pulled the second Crocon off his vest, set it next to the first, and watched both displays. Both confirmed. The methane in the bench section was rising. The cross pull was still running. He could feel the night air moving across the back of his hand at the entry, slow but clean. But the rate of rise told him a deep pocket had opened somewhere up the bench, beyond his 11 timbers, beyond the work he had done, in the part Earl had sealed off with the inner fall in 47, and the rock cribbing that he, Wade, had not touched. This is the part where the engineering will lose a viewer who hasn't followed coal mine ventilation, so I will keep it short. A deep methane pocket in a sealed bench section, undisturbed for 77 years, develops by very slow desorption of methane from the coal seam itself into the void space behind whatever seal is holding it. The volume of methane stored in a working coal seam is not small. A square meter of Pocahontas No. 3 coal at the slope depths of the No. 4 can hold roughly 7 cubic meters of free methane per meter of seam thickness, per the studies the U.S. Bureau of Mines published in the early 80s. The methane sits in the cleat fractures and in the micropores. When the seam is undisturbed, the desorption rate is slow enough that an unventilated void will equilibrate around 2 to 3% CH4 over a few years, and then plateau. 2 to 3% CH4 sits below the 5% lower explosive limit, but above the 1% threshold the Crocon was set to alarm at. Earl's bench section, on the inner side of the fall, had probably equilibrated around 2.5% in the early 1950s, and stayed there for the better part of 7 decades, held in place behind the fall debris and the secondary Brattice his grandfather had built over the cribbed rock face. When Wade opened the cross-pull, the equilibrium broke. Not all at once. The ventilation began drawing the inner pocket out around the fall debris in a slow, irregular pulse that depended on the night atmospheric pressure and the wind across the upper adit. On the still cold morning of the 15th of October, with a high-pressure ridge sitting over the holler and no wind, the upper adit pulled slack. The pocket exhaled. 0.7, 0.9, 1.1. The Crocon's audible alarm clipped on at 1.0, and Wade thumbed it off and let the display run silent. He had 11 minutes from the first reading. He used them. He went back to the cabin, woke nobody. Halifax was already at his hip. Pulled the inner Brattice closed across the bench at the new central panel he had built on day 3. Sealed the lashing at both sides, and pulled the outer plank face most of the way too. He left a slit at the top of the outer face for the cross pull to keep working through. He walked back up to the cabin with the Malinois. He turned around once on the porch and watched the lower portal. The two Crocons sat on the timber. Their green LEDs strobed steadier now that the inner Brattice was closed. He sat down on the porch steps with Halifax against his knee. The reading climbed to 1.8 at 11 minutes after the first alarm. Then it held. Then it began to drop slowly. 1.7, 1.5, 1.3. He watched it through to 1.0 at 28 minutes after the first reading, and then closed his eyes and breathed out for the first time since Halifax had woken him. There are two things I want to say about that night. The first is that a methane reading of 1.8% is 2.5 times below the lower explosive limit, which means the risk of ignition was not high, even if Wade had been carrying an open lamp, and he was not. The Crocons were intrinsically safe to MSHA Part 18, and his headlamp had been off. There was no realistic ignition source in the bench section, and the explosive risk was, in honest engineering terms, low. The second thing I want to say is that none of that mattered to Wade Harlan at 4:12 in the morning of the 15th of October, sitting on the cabin porch with his Belgian Malinois against his knee. Halifax had refused her 30-foot line the way she had refused it on the first dusk. She had read the air 12 minutes before the Crocon had told him to listen. She had been right. He sat with her in the dark and let her be right. By 5:30, the lower portal Crocon read 0.3. By 6, it read 0.1. By 7, with the sun on the upper ridge, both readings were at 0.00, and the cross pull was running 50 centimeters per second through the slit in the plank face. And Wade went back down and reopened the outer face and stood inside the new portal with Halifax and listened to the old timbers settle and looked up at the inner Brattice and at the horseshoe nail pinning the folded letter to the inner timber. He did open the letter that morning. He sat on the bench floor against the secondary Brattice with the Belgian Malinois on the rag rug beside him and the kerosene lamp lit, and the methane reading steady at 0.00 across the morning, and he unfolded the paper carefully along its old creases and read what his grandfather had written on the 8th of October in 1947. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Lottie Wilkinson. It was 3 pages, handwritten in Earl's careful schoolhouse hand, with a few rust-colored stains down the left margin that were probably blood from a cut hand, and not what Wade had thought when he first saw them. The letter said, in summary, the things a man writes when he believes a thing was his fault. It said that Earl had heard the timber at the 21st Bay creak on the Tuesday morning before the fall. It said he had marked the creak in his shift book and had meant to bring it up at the Wednesday safety meeting and had not. It said that on the Thursday morning, when the fall came, Lottie's husband, Tate Wilkinson, and the second man whose name Earl named in the second page were both at the working face, and Earl himself was at Bay 9 and had heard the fall and had walked back as far as the 15th Bay and had not been able to go further. It said the men had not died in the fall. They had been alive, Earl wrote, for perhaps a quarter of an hour after the fall, because Earl had heard one of them call out twice. It said that the company had sealed the section on the Thursday afternoon over Earl's objection. It said that Earl had opened the inner alcove 4 nights later, on the 8th of October, by digging through the rockfill from the upper returnadit because he wanted to be near the men, and that he had slept in the alcove that night, and one other, and had decided he could not do it a third time, and that he was sealing the bench on the morning of the 4th, the date on the outer Brattice, but writing this letter 4 nights earlier so the words would not get away from him. The letter ended, Mrs. Wilkinson, I do not ask anything of you. I write this because I will not say it. I should have called the timber on the Tuesday. I will live with not having called it. The 2 of them did not die at the fall. They died at the slow part. I heard them. I am sorry. Earl Harlan. Wade read it twice. He folded it again along the original creases. He did not put it back on the horseshoe nail. He put it inside the front cover of his grandfather's leather King James Bible, in the bench section Footlocker, where Earl had probably wanted it to go in the first place. I have written letters in my own head to 2 families I never sent. The 2 families are in Mosul. The names of the men whose families they are, I will not write here. I have written the letters maybe 100 times in the slow hours of the night between 2 and 4, when the sleep does not come. The letters all say roughly what Earl's letter said. The letters all admit that there was a Tuesday before the Thursday, and that on the Tuesday, I heard something I should have called out and did not. I do not know if my Tuesdays were the same kind of Tuesday Earl heard at the 21st Bay. I do not know if anyone's are. But sitting in the bench section on the rag rug Verna wove in 1946, with the Belgian Malinois Cole Robles trained at Lackland warm against my hip, with my grandfather's letter to Lottie Wilkinson folded in my hand, I understood for the first time in 77 Octobers exactly why a young Earl Harlan had sealed himself out of his own bench section in 1947 and lived another 56 years and never spoken the names of the two men. He had built the inner alcove, not because the mountain might take him. He had built it because he wanted to be in the room where it had taken the others. Halifax leaned into Wade's side. He sat on the floor of the bench section for perhaps 20 minutes. The kerosene lamp made its small, soft hiss above him. The cross-pull moved cool, clean 51-degree air past his shoulder. The crocon at the portal read 0.00. He closed his eyes. He thought about the engineer in Beckley. He thought about Earl Boggs, his cousin, and Russell Harlan, his great-uncle, and the body wagon Russell had driven down the Lobata Road in the autumn of '47. He thought about November the 1st. He thought about whether he had it in him to do, with the help of his cousin and a reasonable engineer, what Earl Harlan had not been able to do. To keep the bench section, the alcove, the letter, the rug, and the lamp open, ventilated and reachable, for one more generation past his own. He thought he might. He stood up. Halifax stood up with him. He banked the lamp down. They walked out under the cross-pull together, sealed the outer Brattice for the night, and went up the path to the cabin in the slow, steady light of an October mid-morning that was almost warm. Earl Boggs called Wade at the Lobata post office the following Monday morning with the engineer's name. The engineer was named Hollis Vance, 73 years old, retired from the Beckley office of the WV Office of Miners, Health, Safety, and Training in the late 2010s, now doing private structural certifications for personal use slope mine restorations down the Tug Fork at fees Wade could afford. Earl had set up the walkthrough for Wednesday the 23rd. Wade told him that worked. He thanked him and walked out of the post office with the Belgian Malinois at heel and drove the truck back up to the holler in the warm, bright October light. Hollis Vance arrived at 1 in the afternoon on Wednesday in a beige 1997 Ford Ranger with a hard tonneau cover. He climbed out slow and put on a hard hat that had the WV Office of Miners Health stencil partly worn off the front and a fresh USB rechargeable methane sensor clipped to the brim of it. He shook Wade's hand. He looked at Halifax and said, "Marine working dog, I'd guess." "Belgian Malinois," Wade said. "First Marsoc. Came home in '22. "Mine the one in '78, Hollis said. "She was a German Shepherd. I called her Belle. Went 2 years past the kennel rotation." He looked at Halifax once more and then said, "Show me the entry." Wade walked him down the path. Halifax came down to the 30-foot line and stopped. Hollis Vance noted that. "That line's where she's been holding? Since the first dusk. She's right. There's still desorption coming off the intersection. She'll be right for another week." They went into the bench together. Hollis walked the new timbering with his own headlamp and a clipboard, and a slow, measured step that took him about 40 minutes to cover the 11 bays Wade had worked. He photographed each of the 3 Genmar bolt installations with a small digital camera. He pulled the wall fill aside at the secondary Brattice on his own, without Wade having to point it out, looked through it for a long second, said, "I want to see the alcove from inside," and Wade undid the lashing and let him through. Hollis Vance sat on the hand-pegged bench in the alcove for perhaps 5 minutes without saying anything. He looked at the lamp socket bolted into the rock. He looked at the rag rug. He looked at the inner timbering. He looked at the place on the inner timber where the horseshoe nail still stuck out, the letter no longer pinned there. "Who built this?" he said finally. "Earl Harlan, October of '47. "Earl Harlan," Hollis Vance repeated. He nodded slowly. "I worked under a roof bolter named John Harlan, out of a small mine over near Twin Branch in '83. Asked me one shift if I'd ever heard of a man who'd built himself a bench section alcove and sealed it up. Told me his Uncle Earl had done it down at the number 4. I didn't put the names together. John would be my second cousin," Wade said. "He passed in '09. I know it. I went to the wake at the Methodist Church in Williamson. Hollis looked up at the timbering. Your grandfather did a piece of work here, Wade. The cribbing's set right. The Brattice geometry on the secondary is unusual, but it's sound. The fall debris at the inner side has stabilized over 77 years, and the inner roof is more competent now than it was when the fall took it down. With your bolting at the 3 failure timbers and the cross-pull running clean, this section is in better structural condition than half the active personal use restorations down the tug fork. Will you certify it? I'll certify it. I'll write up the engineering letter tonight. You'll have a copy of it by Friday. I want a second methane reading station at the inner side of the secondary Brattice. You can pull a continuous monitoring Crocon for that, the one with the 420 milliampere output. I want a manual logbook with daily readings, and I want a hard cap on bench occupancy at 1 adult and 1 dog at any time. All right, I want to be on record about one more thing. Hollis looked at the rag rug. What you've done is restore a personal use slope mine working that was sealed by its owner under a private decision in the autumn of '47, for reasons that were not technical. I will write that into the engineering letter as part of the historical assessment. Charleston needs to read it. They'll let it stand. Thank you, Hollis. Don't thank me, son. I'm 73 years old, and I have seen too many old workings that ought to have been kept and got plated over by a county that didn't know what it was looking at. Earl Harlan built this. He stood up from the bench. You restore it. They walked out of the alcove and out of the bench section together. Hollis Vance shook Wade's hand at the cabin porch and got back into the Ford Ranger and drove down the switchbacks. Halifax watched the dust until it was around the second bend. Then she went back into the cabin and lay down by the cook stove. The engineering letter came into Earl Boggs at the Mingo County Code Enforcement Office on Friday afternoon. Earl Boggs called Wade at the post office on Friday at 5. He said the letter looked good. He said he was filing the owner-occupant personal use exemption application that afternoon with a hand-carried packet to the Office of Abandoned Minelands in Charleston on Monday morning. He said he had pulled the original 1947 file out of the county archive while he was at it. Wade asked him what was in the original file. Earl Boggs paused on the phone the way an older man pauses when he wants to get the family relation phrasing right. My Uncle Russell, or rather my grandfather's brother, since Russell was the older of the 2 Harlan brothers, and the records on which one was uncle to which descendant get tangled up, filed a personal use restoration paper at the county on the 4th of November in 1947. 1 month and 1 day after Earl sealed the entry. The paper says that the bench section was, quote, sealed by the owner-operator under personal authority for reasons not relating to the structural condition of the working, end quote, and reserves to the owner-operator and his heirs the right to reopen the section under owner-occupant personal use without further county action. The paper was filed in 1947 and never withdrawn. It is still on the books. Wade, your great-uncle Russell filed the protection for your grandfather against the county 8 days after Earl sealed it, so that whatever Earl did next, Earl could undo. The protection has sat in the file drawer for 77 years. Wade did not say anything for a moment. Wade, your grandfather and his brother had this argument worked out before either of them ever wrote a letter to anyone. The county can't make you plate it. They couldn't have made Earl plate it. Russell saw to that in 1947. Thank you, Earl. My Uncle Russell was a hard man and not a kind one, and I do not remember him fondly. I'll tell you that anyway. Understood. The notice of required compliance is rescinded. I am annotating the file this evening. November 1st is off, thank you. I'm going to come up Sunday afternoon if that's all right by you. I want to see the alcove. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday, and I have not been able to stop. Come up, bring something to eat. I've got coffee and bread and not much else. I'll bring a roast and Mavis will send a pie. I'll feed Halifax first, and then we'll eat. That's how it should be. They hung up. Earl Boggs came up Sunday afternoon in the same county truck and wearing this time a brown wool work shirt with no state seal on it. He had a covered roasting pan in the bed of the truck and a pie wrapped in a dish towel on the seat beside him. He took the pan and the pie up onto the cabin porch and set them on the rail and put his hand out flat to Halifax. Halifax accepted the hand at the second breath this time. She let him scratch behind her ear. Earl Boggs said, "She remembers me," and she put her head against his thigh and held it there. They ate the roast and the bread and the pie at the cabin table at 3 in the afternoon, with the door open onto the holler and the October light pouring through. Wade gave Halifax a piece of the roast from his own plate, and Earl Boggs gave her a second one from his. And Halifax took it with the careful, working dog manners she took everything with. After the meal, Wade and Earl Boggs walked down to the portal in the slanting late light. Halifax walked with them as far as the line she had set on the first dusk. Earl Boggs noticed. "She still holds the line. She'll hold it another week. Hollis Vance said so. Hollis would know." They went into the bench section together. Earl Boggs walked the new timbering with his hat in his hand. He did not say anything until they reached the secondary Brattice. Wade undid the lashing and let him through. Earl Boggs sat down on the hand-pegged bench in the alcove, the way Hollis Vance had sat down 4 days before. He looked at the rug. He looked at the lamp socket. He looked at the bench timbers. He looked at the place on the inner timber where the horseshoe nail still stuck out empty. "Where's the letter?" "In the Footlocker. In the King James. It's still here. It's still here." Earl Boggs let out a long breath. He put one hand on the rag rug and the other one on his own knee, and he sat for perhaps 3 minutes without saying anything more. Halifax had come down the bench to the secondary Brattice and lay there. She did not come into the alcove. Earl Boggs looked at her and said, "Why won't she come in?" "I don't know. She comes in here when it's just you." "She does. Then she's giving me the room." "Maybe." "I'll take that," Earl Boggs said. He stood up slowly off the bench. He put his hand briefly against the inner timber. "My granddaddy Russell drove the body wagon down to the Williamson undertaker the night of the fall. He came back up the holler at 1:30 in the morning and slept in the wagon outside the holler house and would not come inside. Verna brought him coffee out at sunrise. He told her not to let Earl come down to the wagon, and she didn't. They buried Tate Wilkinson and the second man on the Sunday. Russell never spoke their names to anyone again, the same as Earl. The two brothers carried it for 56 and 49 years respectively, and went into the ground without ever putting it down. And I have known my whole life that there was something in this holler, past the number 4 turn, that my granddaddy would not come back up to. And I think today is the first day I have understood what it was. And I think your granddaddy left this room here because he knew that one day somebody who could finally bear it would walk in. I do not know whether that is you, Wade, or whether it is the dog, or whether it is the two of you, or whether